Hey, so thank you everyone. Welcome. Today we are in our last session of the TESS 2025 webinar series, right before the main event, which is going to be held at the Key on November 11th and 12th. So today's session is on reflections from Brock University on our institution's ethical framework for educational technologies. Before we begin, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on across Ontario. The eCampus Ontario offices are located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that the land is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And now I will welcome the team from Brock to share their presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that introduction. And I'm just going to share my screen as well, and I'll wait for that to come on. But thank you everyone for making time to join us for this pre-conference webinar. Of course, as you can see, we're going to be talking about Brock's ethical framework for educational technologies. My name is Rajiv Jhangiani, and I have the privilege of serving as Brock University's Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning. And before I begin, I would love to acknowledge that while I'm actually joining you this morning from British Columbia on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Brock University itself is situated on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom, of course, continue to live and work across the Niagara region today. That territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Acknowledging this, of course, reminds us as well that the fantastic, fabulous, great standard of living that we enjoy is directly related to the resources and the friendship of Indigenous peoples. As you were invited to earlier, we invite you to share where you're coming from, as well as your name and any institution you may be affiliated with in the chat. But I want to note that I'm joined today by four incredible colleagues from Brock University, Chelsea Takalo, Karen Louise Smith, Matt Clare, and Julia Forsyth, who will all introduce themselves shortly. But I will tell you already that they are among the reasons why I consider myself so very, very fortunate to work at Brock, incredible place with incredible people and community. The plan for the webinar, folks, is to begin with a very quick overview of Brock's ethical framework before inviting each of the panelists to speak to their perspectives about the framework, including ethical considerations that are especially meaningful to them, opportunities and challenges that they see when it comes to implementation of the framework as well. And we will aim to reserve about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please do reflect on any potential questions that you may want to pose for our panelists using the Q&A function as we go. So as I scroll forward over here, as you will see, Brock's ethical framework for educational technologies was approved by our University Senate earlier this year in May. But you can also see, hopefully, that it is openly licensed. And this is an invitation for anybody else at other institutions to reuse and, of course, adapt and contextualize and build on our work. But although it was, as I mentioned, approved formally a few months ago, its development, of course, was envisioned a fair bit before that, 2 years prior, when our academic plan was approved in January 2023. And I'll ask my colleague Matt Clare to share a link to our academic plan for those interested. The plan includes a commitment to 44 actions that are organized around 5 themes or priorities. And one of those actions is this: to develop and adopt an ethical framework for educational technologies that ensures that the procurement of digital tools do not perpetuate and reinforce systemic inequalities and racial biases. Now, to give you a sense of the development process, we consulted quite widely across the institution, including with, of course, the folks on this webinar who helped shape the document in important ways. But our consultations included administrative colleagues in a variety of areas, from our general counsel to AVP students to our Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement and more, faculty members, including 14 members of the Provost Advisory Group on Artificial Intelligence, members of our Trauma-Informed Practices Group, and of course, student leadership as well. Following consultations and eventually endorsement from 2 Senate committees, we eventually received support and approval from Senate itself. The framework, as you will hopefully see, draws on leading scholarship on technology and education. It draws on expertise from across the Brock community, but also on leading practice from universities and governments around the world. And again, I'll invite Matt to share a link to the framework itself. It's focused on technologies that are directly used to facilitate learning. Hence, it's about educational technology, not just technology writ large. The document includes a brief preamble. It has several links and references to relevant legislation, and then, of course, university policies that apply at Brock, as well as some guidelines. But the framework really centers on 11 ethical considerations, which you're seeing on the screen now. And these are each succinctly described and paired with a brief practical illustration of the kind of risk that we should all wish to avoid. These are the kinds of risks we would think we expose ourselves to when we mistakenly treat legislation, whether it's AODA or FIPA, for example, if we're talking about accessibility or privacy. We often treat within the higher education sector legislation or compliance as the ceiling of what we need to consider instead of the floor, which is, of course, what it should be. And just as a very quick illustration, as people would have seen, algorithmic bias is on the list. And so during the period of remote emergency teaching during the pandemic, of course, we would want to have avoided, as many institutions managed to do, but not all, procuring and using remote exam proctoring tools that are known to discriminate against students with darker skin tones, disproportionately flagging them as being cheating, for example. But it's not just considerations that affect students or faculty, it's also staff that are part of the consideration over here. And that's why we have things like operational sustainability in there as well. For example, if you have a pilot, a successful pilot even with an educational technology, and you want to ramp it up, but your under-resourced staff are unable to do so because resourcing has not been part of the consideration, burnout among under-resourced staff would be another pitfall that we're trying to flag over here. And so while non-binding, this framework is intended to really guide the decision-making of Brock University employees concerning the procurement or the development and certainly the deployment of educational technologies, whether that's at the university level, the unit level, like a faculty, or at the individual level. But it's also the kind of leadership we strongly believe that all universities should be providing during this time of rapid technological change. So with that context and introduction provided, I'm going to next invite my colleague Julia Forsyth to introduce herself and to tell us more about her plans for visual note-taking during today's session. Julia.
Hi, everybody. I'm Julia Forsyth. I'm the director here in the Center for Pedagogical Innovation, just for teaching and learning, along with my colleague Matt, who you'll meet in a minute. For those of you who know me, one of the strategies over the years that I've used to help pay attention in conferences is to doodle and take notes. And so I hope many of you have something in front of you and you're also doodling. And so what we're asking you to do is think about what kind of visualizations come to mind when you hear people talking. So I'll be listening carefully, but I'll also be watching the chat if you want to share some of the ideas and visual metaphors or ideas that come to mind, and I'll try and incorporate them into the drawing, which I'm going to switch my camera now so you can see I kind of have a little bit of a weird setup, but now you can see my my iPad, and so I'll be taking notes, and you can kind of watch the drawing develop as our ideas develop together. So yeah, I'll pass it back to Rajiv to take it from here.
Thank you, Julia. So we're looking forward to seeing what you share in the chat. But for now, I'm going to switch as well. And moving from Julia, I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. And as you will see on the screen, as part of their introduction, they've all been asked to share an image that is meaningful to each of them in relation to Brock's ethical framework for educational technologies. And so I'll first invite my wonderful colleague, Chelsea Takalo, to unmute herself and go.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Chelsea Takalo. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm currently the Associate Vice President of EDI at Brock University. Very happy to be here. The image that I chose to represent my connectedness to this framework is that of intersectionality as coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. I'm sure many of you have seen this image and are familiar of this image, but it's a consistent and constant reminder that who we are as individuals is not singular or siloed or monolithic. We are interconnected, and all of the pieces of our experiences and our identities are woven together to create our full and authentic selves. And as we think about when we're creating this framework, the person who is the user behind this framework is an intersectional being, is a full, multi-layered, multi-experienced individual. And we need to keep that in the back of our minds as we're thinking about our strategies, the tools that we're using, the systems that we're procuring, and what we are presenting as access to our broader community. one of the things that I think is really important is always remembering that there's no technological system that is neutral. And because of that, we always have to be very mindful about how systems can reproduce experiences of power and privilege and marginalization of communities and groups that we work with on a day-to-day basis. An example of how I might see this in my work is being responsible for individuals who are reporting experience of discrimination, harassment, sexual and gender-based violence on campus. Oftentimes they report that information through online forms and forums to our department. When people are reporting their experiences, they have checkboxes. Please identify, are you experiencing racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism? While individuals might be able to identify multiple areas, that is not a fulsome representation of their experiences. And that form doesn't truly allow for them to identify and share the fullness of their experiences in a really meaningful way. And so we always have to think about how are we layering and providing multiple entrances and examples and opportunities for folks to bring in their full, holistic, and authentic selves with an intersectional lens. And so when we're designing these pieces or bringing these pieces in, it's always critically important that we think about who might be harmed or excluded or not represented by this tool, as well as how can we intentionally design and, if needed, modify these tools to ensure we're engaging community care, providing individuals with agency, and keeping the trust of our community members in mind. End of thought.
That was beautiful, Chelsea, and very, very important. Thank you very much for sharing that. You're conjuring up images for me of sort of determining when voices are missing at the table and when it's more appropriate to perhaps build a new table or fix a table entirely. Next up is our colleague, Dr. Karen Louise Smith. Karen, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I feel like my color palette is extending upon Chelsea's first slide here. The image that I have chosen to share is actually, I'll take a step back. I should share first that at Brock, I am a faculty member. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication, Popular Culture, and Film. And now returning to the access rainbow that is before us on the screen. This image is something that's influenced my research for the past 20 years. And it's not something that we've directly referenced in the ethical framework in any way. But what this image is about, it's about really how we move beyond just the technical. And when broadband internet services were being envisioned for Canada, there were two scholars, Andrew Clement and Leslie Shade, and they developed this model to try and get people to think beyond just the technical and things like the OSI model that show the layers of infrastructures and networks. And they were trying to probe and provoke people to think about how we empower communities as technologies are deployed. This is what the Access Rainbow is all about. And it's very much been a backdrop to everything I do as a faculty member who's been involved in things like the AI Advisory Committee that Rajiv mentioned, and also in commenting on the framework when it was in draft form. And keeping in mind that we want to think about how we build infrastructures to support and promote the human rights of the community members that are going to be using those technologies and systems. That's what was at the foundation of this model over 20 years ago, and it's what I'm bringing forward in my work now as I continue to think about AI-powered edtech and the kind of rollout of models within many of the apps and services that we are now encountering on a regular basis. So Rajiv, I think the baton may be passed to Matt next.
It is indeed. I just want to acknowledge as well, Karen, just how important your leadership has been and partnership with faculty writ large, because of course it was the faculty voice at Senate discussions as well that was particularly important for other fellow educators to hear and listen to, and that includes, previous motions that we've had approved at Brock Senate. including, for example, a specific position against the use of tools that purport to detect the use of AI or Gen AI in student coursework as well, which came informed by faculty expertise such as yourself. So thank you again for that. So Matt, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Talk about this framework. I'm Matt Clare, Director of Technology-Enabled Learning in that same Center for Pedagogical Innovation that Julie is also Director of. And my responsibility here at Brock University involves overseeing the support and the administration of our learning management system principally, the tools and technologies connected to it, and liaising with our partners in central IT from a technical perspective, governance and other components of the institution to deliver our educational technologies. The reason I selected the railroading image here is to mix a whole bunch of metaphors, which I'll begin with right now. Of course, you may be aware that the original hacking definition comes from, is mostly attributed to the MIT Railroad Hacking Club and how they used to hack together their rails. So it's a little more child-appropriate, safe way to hack with these children's toys wooden rails in the picture I chose. And I think that it also extends to the many ways that the technical, the organizational, the policy, procedure, bureaucratic components of the institution connect into ways that we expect, ways we don't expect, in ways that complement each other, in ways that don't necessarily complement each other, and in ways that we could anticipate and replicate, and some that we will never anticipate and probably shouldn't replicate. The ways that these various technologies, policies manifest is hard to predict before it happens, and then maybe even afterwards, like the rails connecting on a child's wooden road set. I'll throw it back to Rajiv.
Well said, Matt. So I think just looking at across all three comments over here, I think there are several overlapping themes, as you might imagine, but between intersectionality and access, and even, Matt, when you talk about how institutions, sometimes in expected or unexpected ways, are not accounting for certain things, I'll squeeze in one more image, which I think helps illustrate that, oftentimes with EdTech and with education in general, you can do harm with the very best of intentions. You can quite easily reinforce the status quo and existing societal power hierarchies. And so I'm going to share an image that was in a beautiful illustration by the talented illustrator Brian Mathers. This is something I'd asked him to do at my previous institution, where he's openly licensed. And it makes the point that if you simply design for the mode, whether it's, assuming that during the period of remote emergency instruction, that students all have laptops and broadband internet access at home, let's say, or, that it's what is the issue with defaulting to, let's say, and I don't want to jump ahead of myself too much, but to legal names when it comes to connecting the student information system and the learning management system, you are doing harm. And part of that comes from who's not at the table, of course. So this, of course, takes us to the next question, which is, again, we're going to invite you as participants, and even if you're watching this asynchronously later, to reflect on this question. Looking at the 11 dimensions within, or 11 principles within our ethical framework, we'd love for you to pick what, given term, pick one of the ones that speaks to it, but what does it mean to you in relation to ethics and educational technologies? And for those of you following in the chat, thank you, Karen, for pasting the text of that question in there as well. But this is really the question we're going to pose now to our panelists, again, in turn, and once again, starting with Chelsea.
So care and well-being is of utmost importance to me personally, professionally, in the work that I do. When we think about inclusion and belonging and equity, we can't have those conversations without thinking about the care and well-being of every individual on campus, especially those who are reflective of equity deserving and equity denied groups. One of the pieces that was critically important for me in this work connected to care and well-being in educational systems when I came to Brock, which I just came about 2022, is I was going through the human rights data and what concerns students, staff, and faculty were bringing forward, and thinking about, like, are there systemic priorities that we can set or try to work through? And one of the things that became very common was noticing that students, and specifically trans and non-binary students, were identifying that they were being dead named in systems. And the way that they were being dead named in systems is they had noted that they had put in a request to shift their name through the student information system. However, that information was not talking to other systems. So while it might have been updated in one space, places like housing or in recreation or on their actual physical Brock card that were all distinct systems, it was not being updated in those spaces. And so every day those students had to face a moment where they were being dead named because of not having a consistent approach or strategy to that updating name system. So we worked through that in 3 different ways. The first way that we responded was by connecting with the registrar's office and creating a form that, once it was received, would trigger communication that would go to every single system across the university where that student's name was currently being housed. The second way we addressed it is recognizing the current process that we had for designated student emails was listed currently by their initials. So we also recognize if a student is shifting their name, their initials might shift as well. So even having those initials at the beginning would be an opportunity for potential dead naming. And so through ITS, we worked to shift to a randomized alphanumeric system of providing students with emails instead of having their initials starting those emails. And then lastly, recognizing students might need support if they wanted with navigating a legal name change system. We provided a designated support person in the Human Rights and Equity Office to provide systems navigation if they wanted to go through a legal name change, and potentially funding through what we designed as the Gender Affirmation Fund. And so we recognize that anytime a student is dead named, we are impacting their well-being, even through a systems approach. And we needed to work through to rectify that situation to ensure that there was equitable and inclusive access for all that was respectful of the care and well-being of our student body and community. End of thought.
Thank you very much for that. I see, of course, that we have one of our many participants who's raised their hand at the moment. So perhaps just I know there's a few things we want to cover and we want to save time for Q&A. So I'm going to suggest that if it's a quick comment, if you wouldn't mind typing that in the chat for now. But if it is a question, certainly feel free to put it into the Q&A function as well, and we'll be sure to get to that fairly soon. But with that, again, I'm going to turn to Karen to share again your response to the same question. Oh, and Karen, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. The principle that I've decided to speak about today is design justice. And to illustrate and represent that, I've put a screenshot of the book that uses that title by Sasha Costanza-Chock. And just in the chat for the webinar, I've thrown in a link to the open access version of this book in case anyone is interested. But in terms of the importance and the link of this book and this concept to the framework, what I would like to highlight is some of the design principles and practices that underpin this concept. And I'm also going to share a link to a website which includes the principles. And within the website on the Design Justice Network's principles, the authors state, design justice rethinks design processes, centers people who are normally marginalized by design, and uses collaborative, creative practices to address the deepest challenges our communities face. And to me, this is such an important provocation and such an important piece of advice that we can take to heart when we're located in educational institutions like universities or colleges or any form of post-secondary institution, because of the power hierarchies that are implicit in our institutions. There are people who are administrators, there are people who are faculty members, there are people who are staff that make a lot of choices and decisions that that function to yield power over the lives of community members and students. And those power relations are implicit in the kinds of ways that our institutions are structured. And so, why design justice is important to a framework that deals with ethics and educational technologies is it prompts us and opens up the opportunity to think about things differently and to think about sharing power or distributing power or doing things differently. In terms of some of the prompts on the principles website, some of the principles include kind of reframing or reshifting the balance between designers as experts and to try and share some of the expertise. And that means bringing participants, that means bringing students or community members and their experiences to bear and ensuring that those are accounted for in the kinds of systems we design and the technologies that we deploy. There's also attention to things like working towards non-exploitative solutions and being aware of the kind of intersectional identities of all community members within a post-secondary setting and thinking about how to be fair and just to all of those parties so that they don't experience something like exploitation. Putting this in the framework is a way to try and do things differently. And for me, it's an opportunity and an opening when an institution is considering something that is potentially problematic to shine a light on what some of those power dynamics are and what some of those problems are, and to make that more visible to others.
Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate you shining that light on the intentionality of that design. These things don't just happen, of course, and if we let them just happen, that also is a function of the previous design or lack thereof. We'll move now to Matt to respond to the same question.
Thanks, Rajiv. I wanted to pick up on the idea of digital literacy. So we need to, in our center, support instructors and teaching TAs on their good, big, and small decision making. There's so much that changes in technology. I'm old enough to remember when people would revolt at interface changes on platforms that weren't Reddit. And now all our technologies are changing every time we log in. There are new technology solutions, et cetera, being pitched to instructors and others all the time. And the thing that used to have automation now has a thing called AI in it. And you're forced to try and interpret what that really means. So we're supporting our instructors in their good, big, and small decision making is important. Build that capacity within them, because there is a role for some element of gatekeeping, but it's never going to be as effective as informed decision making by the person practicing the teaching. So we want to translate technology into our teaching practice by helping instructors understand digital tools and how they advance pedagogy, not just how they use them. Facilitate peer learning, encourage TAs and faculty to share tips and case studies through their own practice, through CPI, Center for Pedagogical Information, Innovation, and community practice. Clarify what's supported versus self-supported. There's definitely a suite of technologies that our institution supports, but we don't necessarily support Android, yet we expect people to have phones and use them. There are these divisions that we understand that are being navigated by people living through these technologies at every one moment. And no one wants us to enumerate what's supported and not supported to that level. Having said that, we do encounter challenges where these small decisions have big impacts when someone who isn't very literate in the decision they're making makes something that maybe we wouldn't have advised. And these literacies change over time. And that's my initial joke about interface changes, is that we need to be prepared and expect change, not try to combat it. Finally, I'll add that we want our instructors and others at our higher education institutions to engage in reflective practice. This is part of being an post-secondary institution, and it can inform everything from research to, of course, teaching and the tools that we use. That's my reflection.
Appreciate that, Matt. And if I'm going to just pick on one little example that I think ties all three reflections together, it's, if we think about the community of educators at Brock, certainly, but at any institution, really, I mean, it's not just, and you talked about TAs and graduate students, for example. You talked about faculty, of course, and you mentioned instructors, but I think intentionally planning for how contingent faculty members are supported, both to look out with care and well-being, of course, but to make sure that we're understanding the conditions that they are experiencing. And so, how can we support their development? How can we build their literacy? How can we involve them in the decision-making process? Is also part of that conversation with design justice as well as literacy. Before we go to the final question for the panel, I just want to briefly touch on some of the beautiful examples shared in the chat from our attendees to our very first question. And as to refresh your mind, the question was, what images would you pick to represent the idea of ethics and educational technologies? And I'm going to highlight three of them. So one beautiful example was a tree with deep roots reflecting the 11 principles and leaves or branches representing EdTech. So thank you for that contribution, Kate. Susan shares, like a labyrinth in Celtic mythology, they symbolize complex journeys. So I love the idea of a labyrinth. And of course, at Brock, we are very fortunate to have a labyrinth that you could experience yourself directly. And Stephen shares, two glasses of water, one clean, the other polluted. And maybe I'll squeeze in a fourth from Hannah, talked about an image, a mirror as the image, a mirror as EdTech for a person as ethics reflecting in the mirror. So thank you for those thoughtful contributions and food for thought for Julia, who, as you can see, has already visually incorporated some of these visuals into her note-taking. So with that, we're going to turn to the final question before we open up for questions for our panelists. And this, again, is a question that we will pose to each of our panelists individually, but it is, once again, a question we would pose to all of you and invite you to respond to in the chat as well, which is really, when you look at the framework that we have at Brock, what is an implementation opportunity, perhaps, or an implementation challenge that you anticipate in the future? So again, we will start with Chelsea.
Thanks so much. I think one of the challenges on an ongoing basis is how are we balancing efficiency and usability with privacy and inclusion? We know that when we want to move towards inclusion, it takes much more thought and reflection and consideration. It takes much more time, which not everyone has access to for a variety of reasons. And so when we think about what some of these issues or challenges might look like, when we're using systems or we're bringing in systems that we think are effective, that provide us with positive resources or opportunities, what do those look like? So even when we think about things like the who's online feature, so we might think seeing who's online is beneficial. It lets us know who's accessing things or where people are at. But the who's online feature creates potential risk and barriers for some individuals. So for example, for survivors of gendered or sexual violence, they might see that who's online feature as something that could cause them anxiety, something that could potentially put them at risk. For equity deserving and equity denied students, knowing that they're visible could potentially impact feelings of surveillance, which might impact their ability to engage meaningfully in this space or not. Additionally, when we think about not just who's online or visibility, I think data visibility is also critically important. So in my role in the Human Rights and Equity Office, we have been looking at case management systems to hold data from folks who are bringing forward concerns or complaints. And as I've been reaching out to different organizations and companies and going through the ways that their products work, visibility is often built in to say, we want different departments to know what's happening in different departments, to be able to access, are we seeing a consistent trend from particular students or particular staff and faculty? And part of that is meant for care and well-being, to literally say, is there a student who's experiencing harm across different areas that we want to ensure we're providing appropriate supports for? However, the other side of that is how are we violating the privacy of individuals, especially those who are coming into our spaces to share concerns of discrimination or harassment or violence or harm. We want to make sure that their names, that their experiences are completely confidential and that other people can't have access to them. And in a number of systems that I've been looking into, they all provide some type of visibility to different areas. So that might just be a name of a case file, or it might be not a name, but which staff member in the institution oversees that case file, which in the Human Rights and Equity Office, if it says Chelsea Takalo, everyone knows that that's a human rights complaint in the system. And so as we're thinking about some of the challenges, again, it's how do we negotiate userability, opportunities for people across the institution to connect to data, while also ensuring that we are maintaining privacy for the individuals who are accessing our services and supports, which is of critical importance. End of thought.
Thank you very much for that, Chelsea. Karen, your thoughts?
Thanks. The image that I'm going to speak to is once again created by Brian Mathers. So this image is actually from a previous webinar that I participated in and was a panelist for. And I've used this image today because the idea of opting out is something that I think is going to be a massive challenge for institutions as we grapple with educational technologies. And the reason that opt-outs are going to be potentially so challenging and may even be a myth or something that is more mythical than realized is because of how entrenched data intensive processing and artificial intelligence is within the platforms and systems that our institutions already procure. And from my perspective as a faculty member, I don't directly procure or oversee any of the contracts that involve educational technology. But I can imagine that it is massively difficult for institutions to create off-ramps with vendors and to ensure that there's ways for people to ensure that their data isn't used in ways that they're uncomfortable with, and to manage those contracts so that this becomes even possible for our user communities, which include faculty members, staff, community members, sometimes students, a whole range of different users. So this image about an educator's repository of ethical statements to opt out is about, really, to me, this image is about how hard it is to do that in practice. And it's something that I am happy that I have colleagues at Brock that they're willing to engage in these difficult conversations and to really thoughtfully consider how we try to make this real in people's lives, to make sure that their data isn't collected and used in ways that they're uncomfortable with. I mentioned power hierarchies before, and these are incredibly important to consider when we're thinking about situations where students may feel obliged to consent to things, and in situations where they need to write their exams or they need to submit their assignments. And the critical questions here are about setting up these systems in ways that allow for the dignity and the respect and kind of a full spectrum of human rights for students that include their privacy rights to be upheld. And this image represents that massive challenge that is ongoing.
Thank you for that, Karen. You're making me think of a few things right now, but when Chelsea, you talked about the importance of working with or talking to vendors and figuring out what their systems are set up to do, how they maybe are in tension with what you're trying to achieve, and the needs of care and well-being. Karen, you're correctly also pointing to the challenges we've had, and I can give you lots of practical examples at Brock, and I'll try not to name a specific vendor, but it's a bit like Voldemort, right? I mean, everybody knows who you're talking about when you talk about the most commonly used plagiarism detection tool, or the tool that purports to detect plagiarism anyway. But it's a good example of when Gen AI became the thing that everybody's stakeholders and venture capitalists were looking to see how the company is going to infuse it into its platform. We were given a very narrow window, a matter of days, to indicate and have the opportunity to opt out of this qualitative change to the nature of how student data would be used at Brock. And it took a lot for us to be able to meet that threshold and make that decision to opt out in that very, very narrow window. But I think, as you're correctly pointing out, it's increasingly not a discrete choice, but with the infiltration, with the lack of agency on the part of the university, in some cases, it takes a lot of attention and intentionality to be able to position us in a space where we can, in fact, opt out. And I say this knowing that even the existing use case of that particular software is already deeply problematic because, of course, the entire value of that entity is based on the monetization of student intellectual labor as well. And so with that happy thought, I'll pass it over to Matt, who's experienced these challenges firsthand all the time.
Yeah, I'll expand on that particular challenge and come back to other remarks. But one particular issue is that we sign these moderately long-term contracts and we have expectations for continuous improvement. We don't want to wait till the next contract for it to work better. Gives the provider of that service some ability to modify our experience, and we want that for the better. It also gives them the opportunity to make it worse by different measures. And I think that something like a framework gives the people involved a way to respond that isn't based on contract language, that isn't based on policy, but also is more immediate and can be more responsive to these subtle, urgent changes. An example I often give is that one of the elements in this framework is accessibility. Depending on your interpretation, it's illegal for us to procure anything that's inaccessible in Ontario, and it certainly is against Brock University's accessibility policies. But sometimes, in effect, all of our tools are completely accessible until someone uses them. And using them is kind of the point. So with ways that the letters, the low bar that should be considered of the law can be used to comply with that low bar, as Rajiv's already said, shouldn't be the ceiling but the floor. And likewise, no one wants to enumerate how this text box will work and so and so and so. So the framework gives a way for everyone involved to reflect on these things, to feel like they have some agency to push back when they need to, and to understand changes as they arise. That's certainly one of our challenges. This framework has to exist, and to my image, on, above, in, around all of our policies. This particular image has my metaphor of railroads, toy roads on top of other roads and tracks, et cetera, and everything seems to be fine. But also they're not exactly the same. This is the space that all of our practices operate within. And one challenge that we have as a Center for Pedagogical Innovation, got the title right, is if we start saying no to everything, we're not exactly representing innovation. We have to be prepared to embrace new things, to understand what those challenges might be, to speak to giving knowledge to the person making those big and small decisions, digital literacy, to embrace new things and not be just calling our job saying no unless it's the thing we approved 5 years ago. That's certainly a challenge in applying these frameworks.
Thank you for that, Matt. And maybe that gives the opportunity as well to remind folks that, our framework was developed, as you know, for our context. It, of course, draws on broader practice as well. And one of the things it draws on as well, just to give you something more to point to as well, is an ethical ed tech toolkit that has been released by the Ministry of Advanced Education in British Columbia. I was also involved in that working group that led to the development and publication of that resource. But I share this because this has recently been shared with all of the public post-secondary institutions in BC. And so as more institutions start to embrace and adopt guidelines like this, and there's lots of commonalities between our framework and the BC EdTech Toolkit. It contains a few more useful resources and appendices as well. I think it makes it easier as well for us to stand together as a sector, whether it's at the consortial level or even at the national level, to be able to indicate this is the bar, this is the threshold, folks, whether we're talking about RFPs formally or anything else that you need to meet if we're going to do business with you. And so I'm going to share that, and Matt's already shared that in the chat as a resource. So thank you for that, Matt. And so with that, you'll see that just a few things that we've already referred to along the way, some references, but this is that time where we can turn to your questions as well. So I'm going to perhaps try and see if I can look at the questions while I leave this up for a little bit. But I see we have two questions up at the moment. Right. So I think there's a question that's really about I'm not sure how to interpret this, but it says meaning for ethics and ed tech, agency with identity at the center. And I love that as a thought, as a provocation, and perhaps I just invite our panelists to respond to that, or perhaps augment that as well with your own thinking. And I'll just read that again. Meaning for ethics and ed tech is agency with identity at the center.
I can take a first attempt at that question.
Sure.
I am seeing the intersectionality wheel as I kind of look at the words in that prompt, and I'm curious if the person who typed that, if they might have perhaps been thinking of some of the visualization and visual note taking that Julia's doing right now. I think she's got something very wheel-like on the screen that we can see at this moment. And this kind of phrase, it really just reinforces for me how much work there is to do to kind of return to and to protect a very fundamental part of post-secondary education, which to me is about building future citizens and creating spaces and learning environments and sandboxes that make that possible, and remaining attentive and respectful to the individuals and their identities to be as integral to that.
Thanks for that, Karen. Yeah, I mean, I think the Elizabeth who posed the question may have been responding to that earlier prompt as well. But I really appreciate again the emphasis on identity over here, and I say this because so much of our design, unintentional design perhaps, in higher ed, you know, removes the individual's identity from that design process, right? Even if we're just talking about a teaching and learning context, the assumption that students are able to complete a certain amount of coursework because they're not working, or that they have a safe and quiet and reliable place to study and work at home because they don't have parental responsibilities. These are all faulty assumptions that disregard and perhaps ignore the reality of students' identities. And then, of course, pouring on top of that, the importance of agency being key over here. Both in terms of a meaningful learning experience, but also being able to make decisions that are right for you, whether it's a student being able to opt out of their intellectual property being absorbed by a multinational company that is monetizing it, and having an alternative for that, or even just a choice of assignments in terms of approaches that look like open pedagogy. Wonder if there are any other reflections from the group before we perhaps look to another question.
Yeah, for me, I'm so appreciative of that. And I'm always thinking about when we're centering identity, and we're even more so centering the identities of individuals who we know experience barriers based off of their social identities. When we think about things like inclusive design or universal design for learning. It's about how are we ensuring that as we design things, like Rajiv said earlier, we're being mindful of centering the margins. And when you said center identity first, I thought, yes, how are we centering the margins? And then how are we creating opportunities for voice and choice for all students, for all stakeholders? And how are we explicitly designing voice and choice and agency in ways that recognize that different communities need to access or provide voice and choice in a variety of different ways? So how are we always thinking about consistent evolvement of the ways that we're providing support, services, structures, opportunities for contributions? And as we evolve and get feedback, how are we ensuring that we are consistently shifting our practices based off of the feedback and voice that we receive from people as we increase their opportunities for agency? I'm just so grateful and thankful for those two words, because they're often embedded in all of the things that I try to consider in my practice as well.
I appreciate that. And I suppose that the word that's implicit over there is, a world in which we consider identities, higher education sector, learning environment even, and where learners and educators both have agency, is a world that is oriented more intentionally towards justice. So I suppose that for me is part of the underlying current over there. That part is part of the goal, is not trying to do harm, not trying to replicate power structures or hierarchies, and really catalyzing that societal transformation, sometimes through leadership like this. But Matt?
I think I have to add a technical perspective. I agree that this comment, the question, is definitely about the socially constructed concepts of identity. But the technically constructed concepts of identity and agency, I think, are really important these days for people involved in service delivery. As resources are diminished, as we all want to, the buzzword is shift left, to get things into the individual's hands for their agency, and where technology previously had the double keys on the server room and a firewall on the servers as our front line for cybersecurity. Now it is identity. The breach is going to happen by that individual who was busy doing some other task on their iPad, holding a child on the other hand, and they got prompted to authorize that thing. And so they did it. Identity is our new perimeter for cybersecurity. And as a society, we aren't completely clear on what we mean when we say the word identity.
I will
Thank you,
just
Matt.
I will riff off of that. I think when we think about things like remote proctoring during the pandemic and systems that use technologies like facial recognition and basically algorithms and AI to verify identity on the basis of facial features, I think the ed tech sector and campus communities need to be very aware of what kind of technical developments are on the horizon. And in terms of global infrastructures, things like age verification, the use of faces for age verification is something that is being pursued in a number of jurisdictions. And I think we can anticipate that there will be vendors that want to add some of these functionalities that analyze faces for a variety of purposes to our systems and products. And staying very attuned to what some of the equity and rights implications and justice implications of those design choices of infrastructure it's incredibly important to me.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Karen. And I think, informing oneself, organizing oneself so that we do not end up being unwitting brokers for surveillance capitalism, I think is an imperative at this time. But, this has been such an engaging, insightful, and meaningful discussion. And I want to thank all of you for I think amply demonstrating just why I feel so fortunate to work alongside you at Brock. But I'd love at this moment as well to give the final word to the mesmerizing illustrator who we've been watching on the screen. Julia, would you like to share and perhaps even zoom out and where you're planning to share this beautiful work for folks who want to take a closer look?
Okay, yeah. Thank you for all the really insightful comments. I love listening to my colleagues talk about this, and it's so important. So it's always very inspiring. Um, I tried to pull in as many of the ones that we talked about related to the principles as possible, and tried to incorporate the images that people spoke. I would like to spend a little bit of time of doing a little more integration. I think the roots and the leaves was really powerful, and I'd like to also pull that in. But I think you know, a lot of the points are things that are really challenging things that we have ahead. So I'm just really grateful for the opportunity for us to discuss it, and all the people who are in the room listening. And that maybe I love the idea of us as standing together as a sector. So taking down their institutional barriers and talking about how we can do this all together, because I feel like it's more than just higher ed that is facing these kind of challenges. Where will I share this? I don't know where to share this. I was hoping to give it to eCampus Ontario afterwards, and then whatever place that people go. Speaking of all the problematic social media places, I'll switch my camera so I can look at you when I say that. So what maybe LinkedIn, where are people sharing things
we're
these
happy to
days?
share it on an email and send it out to everybody.
It's in the recording. Yeah,
Yeah,
Matt's
it's in the
got it.
recording.
Okay.
We'll share it
Yeah.
out. We'll tag you for
Okay.
sure.
That sounds wonderful, Julia, and thank you for doing that. I mean, I think, the good thing is I think even just having that illustration on hand will be a good reminder of this conversation. But hopefully attendees, and thank you all of you who've signed up for the live session, and those of you who are watching this later as well, will hopefully benefit from. You do not need to be the first one to do this. You're certainly not. So feel free to look on our framework at Brock. Feel free to look at the BC EdTech Toolkit as well, and reach out if you want to have discussions and collaborate in this space. Because, of course, as Julia has pointed out in the illustration as that came up earlier, it's much easier for us to do this work together as a sector, to share, to learn, to protect ourselves, and to advance, the where we need to go in a way that does not imperil the very values that brought us into this work in the first place. So thank you very much for making time to join the webinar, folks. And with that, I'll hand things back to our colleagues at eCampus.
Thank you so much, Rajiv, and thank you so much, Julia, Matt, Karen, Chelsea. It was so insightful and robust to see everything in action, and you could see all the work that's been done behind the scenes to put it together. Big thank you for everyone who joined us today. We are looking forward to hosting TESS live in person November 12th at the Key. If you haven't got your tickets, this is the time to get it. This is the last call. All videos today will be posted on our YouTube channel, and there'll be an email sent out later on. So thank you, everyone. Bye.